When I think back to that humid Thursday evening in August, the smell of barbecue smoke still clinging to my clothes, I never could have predicted how completely my world would shatter in the space of 72 hours. The ceiling fan in our kitchen was spinning lazily overhead, its gentle whoosh mixing with the distant hum of traffic on Maple Street, and I was standing at the sink washing dishes when my phone buzzed with a text that would change everything. The water was warm against my hands, sudsy and comforting, steam rising from the ceramic plates as I scrubbed away the remnants of our family dinner. My sister Sarah had just left with her husband Marcus and their twin boys, and the house felt hollow in that particular way it always did after hosting company. The silence seemed to press against my eardrums, broken only by the soft clink of silverware against porcelain and my husband David's muffled voice from the living room as he watched the evening news. My phone screen lit up with a message from an unknown number. The blue light reflected off the soapy water, casting ripples of illumination across the white subway tiles of our backsplash. I dried my hands on the kitchen towel, that familiar red and white checkered pattern that had hung on our oven handle for 3 years, and picked up the device with fingers still slightly damp. The message was short, direct, and it made my stomach drop like a stone thrown into deep water. Meet me at Riverside Park tomorrow at noon. I have information about your family you need to hear. The sender identified themselves only as Jennifer Walsh, and something about that name tugged at the edges of my memory like a song you cannot quite place. I called out to David, my voice carrying that particular pitch it gets when anxiety starts creeping up my throat. He appeared in the kitchen doorway, his reading glasses perched on the end of his nose, salt and pepper hair slightly mussed from leaning back in his recliner. His brown eyes, warm as coffee in the morning light, searched my face with the kind of concern that comes from 22 years of marriage. The scent of his cologne, that woody aftershave he had worn since our college days, mixed with the lingering aroma of the pot roast we had shared earlier. I showed him the message, watching his expression shift from mild curiosity to something harder, more guarded. His jaw tightened in a way I had learned to recognize over the years, the muscle jumping just beneath the skin near his ear. We talked late into the night, voices hushed even though we were alone in our own home. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 11 times, its deep bronze notes echoing through rooms filled with the detritus of family life. Children's art projects still magnet to the refrigerator, though our kids were grown. Wedding photos and vacation snapshots arranged on every available surface, documenting decades of shared history. David thought I should ignore the message, delete it and move on with our lives. But curiosity has always been my weakness, that insatiable need to know, to understand, to pull at loose threads until entire tapestries unravel. I told him I was going to the park, and he insisted on coming with me. The next morning dawned gray and muggy, the kind of weather that makes clothes stick to your skin before you even step outside. I chose a simple blue sundress, something that would not stand out in a crowd, and tied my auburn hair back in a low ponytail. David wore his usual weekend uniform of khakis and a polo shirt, navy blue with tiny white anchors embroidered near the hem. Riverside Park in the noon heat was nearly deserted except for a jogger with earbuds and an elderly man feeding ducks near the pond. The grass was brown in patches, thirsting for rain that had not come in weeks. We found a bench beneath an oak tree whose leaves provided blessed shade, and I checked my watch obsessively, silver against my wrist, counting down the minutes. She appeared at exactly 12:05, a woman in her early 30s with blonde hair pulled into a severe chignon and eyes the color of winter sky. She wore a gray blazer despite the heat, and carried a leather messenger bag that looked expensive. Her heels clicked against the concrete walkway as she approached, each step deliberate and measured. Jennifer Walsh introduced herself as an investigative reporter for the Herald Tribune, and my heart began to pound so hard I was certain she could hear it. The sound of blood rushing in my ears mixed with the distant splash of ducks in the pond and the rustle of leaves overhead. She sat down across from us, her back straight, hands folded in her lap like a student waiting for class to begin. What she told us over the next 45 minutes felt like watching a building collapse in slow motion. Frame by frame, beam by beam, until nothing recognizable remained. She knew things about our family that should have been impossible for an outsider to know. Private conversations, financial details, personal struggles we had shared only with those closest to us. She knew about David's gambling problem from 8 years ago, the one we had hidden from everyone while he attended meetings and we slowly climbed out of debt. She knew about our daughter Emma's eating disorder during her senior year of high school, the secret therapy sessions and careful monitoring of meals. She knew about my affair with my college boyfriend 15 years ago, that 3-week mistake that nearly destroyed our marriage and which we had worked through with painful honesty and counseling. But most shocking of all, she knew about the money. The inheritance from my grandmother that we had kept secret from extended family, afraid of the jealousy and requests that would inevitably follow. $68,000 that we had quietly invested, money that had allowed us to pay off the mortgage early and send both kids to college without loans. I felt physically sick, bile rising in my throat, that metallic taste that comes before vomiting. David's hand found mine on the bench, his palm warm and slightly rough from weekend yard work, and I gripped his fingers like they were the only thing keeping me from falling into an abyss. Jennifer's voice was calm, professional, as she explained that someone very close to our family had been feeding her information for months. Someone with intimate knowledge of our lives, our struggles, our most guarded secrets. She would not reveal her source, but she wanted to give us the opportunity to respond before her story went to print. The walk back to our car felt endless, our footsteps echoing off the hot pavement. The leather seats were burning to the touch, and I could smell that distinctive scent of overheated vinyl and fabric softener from the air freshener hanging from the rearview mirror. David started the engine and cranked the air conditioning to its highest setting, cold air blasting from the vents and raising goosebumps on my arms despite the heat. We drove home in silence, both lost in our own thoughts, trying to process what we had just heard. The radio played softly in the background, some pop song from the 90s that I had heard 1,000 times but could not name. Traffic lights changed from red to green and back again, the rhythm of suburban life continuing around us while our world tilted off its axis. At home, we sat at the kitchen table where we had shared thousands of meals, made countless plans, weathered numerous storms. The wooden surface was marked with rings from coffee mugs and scratches from homework sessions and craft projects. Afternoon sunlight streamed through the window above the sink, illuminating dust motes that danced in the air like tiny planets in a golden solar system. David made coffee, his movements automatic and practiced. The familiar sounds of the brewing machine filled the silence, punctuated by the soft whoosh of the refrigerator cycling on and the distant hum of the neighbor's lawnmower. The rich aroma of French roast began to permeate the kitchen, mixing with the lingering scent of the lemon-scented dish soap I had used the night before. We began to analyze everyone in our inner circle, turning over relationships like stones in a stream, looking for signs we had missed. My sister Sarah and her husband Marcus were the obvious suspects, given their proximity to our lives and their knowledge of family history. Sarah had always been envious, even as children, wanting whatever I had, comparing our lives in ways that left her consistently dissatisfied. Marcus had joined our family 12 years ago when he married Sarah, and while he had always seemed friendly enough, there was something about him that I had never quite trusted. Maybe it was the way his eyes would shift away when he spoke, or how he always seemed to be listening just a little too intently to conversations that did not concern him. They knew about the inheritance because Sarah had been there when grandmother's will was read. They knew about David's gambling because Marcus had been the one to recommend the support group after noticing David's erratic behavior during football season. They knew about Emma's struggles because Sarah had been my confidant during those difficult months, the person I called when I was scared and desperate for advice. But the affair, that was different. Only 3 people knew about that betrayal and the rocky months that followed. David, myself, and our marriage counselor, Dr. Patricia Hernandez, who was bound by confidentiality agreements that would end her career if violated. Or so I thought. That evening, as David grilled chicken on our back patio, the coals glowing orange and red in the gathering dusk, I called Dr. Hernandez's office. The receptionist informed me that Dr. Hernandez had retired 6 months ago and moved to Florida. Her practice had been taken over by a younger therapist, and all patient files had been transferred or destroyed according to patient wishes. I hung up feeling more confused than ever, sitting on our back steps as evening insects began their nightly symphony. The air was cooling slightly, carrying the mingled scents of charcoal smoke, blooming jasmine from the neighbor's yard, and the faint chemical tang of chlorine from the pool 3 houses down. Fireflies blinked in and out of existence among the bushes, their tiny lights like stars fallen to earth. David brought me a plate of grilled chicken and corn on the cob, still steaming in the humid air. We ate mostly in silence, both lost in our own thoughts, the weight of the day's revelation settling over us like a heavy blanket. The citronella candle on our patio table flickered and danced, casting moving shadows across the weathered wooden deck boards. Later that night, unable to sleep, I found myself standing at our bedroom window looking out at the quiet suburban street. Streetlights cast pools of yellow light at regular intervals, illuminating empty sidewalks and parked cars. The night was thick with humidity, the kind that makes sheets cling to your skin and turns simple breathing into conscious effort. David lay beside me, his breathing deep and even, occasionally interrupted by the soft whistle that meant his sinuses were acting up again. I envied his ability to sleep, to shut off the endless loop of questions and scenarios that played in my mind like a movie I could not stop watching. The next morning brought no answers, only more questions and a growing sense of dread that settled in my stomach like undigested food. I called in sick to work, something I rarely did, and spent the morning pacing our house like a caged animal. Every familiar object seemed to mock me with its normalcy. The coffee mug collection on our kitchen counter, accumulated over years of vacations and gift exchanges. The throw pillows on our sofa, chosen to match the paint color we had debated for weeks before finally deciding. David left for his job at the insurance agency, kissing me goodbye at the front door as he had done every weekday for over 2 decades. His lips were warm against mine, tasting faintly of toothpaste and coffee, and I watched him back out of our driveway in his silver Honda, the same car he had driven for 6 years and refused to replace despite its growing collection of dings and scratches. Alone in the house, I found myself drawn to our home office, a converted spare bedroom lined with filing cabinets and bookshelves. David's desk sat beneath the single window, its surface covered with the organized chaos of his work life. Insurance forms and client files stacked in neat piles, a calculator with numbers worn off from years of use, a coffee mug shaped like a golf ball that our son had given him 3 Christmases ago. I began searching through our files, looking for anything that might explain how a reporter could have gained access to such intimate details of our lives. Bank statements, medical records, tax returns, all stored in manila folders with David's careful handwriting on the tabs. Everything seemed normal, innocent, exactly as it should be. But then I found something that made my blood run cold. Hidden behind our mortgage documents, in a folder labeled simply miscellaneous, I discovered copies of documents I did not remember making. Bank statements from the account where we had deposited grandmother's inheritance money, photocopied and stored in a file I had never seen before. Notes in handwriting I did not recognize, documenting dates and amounts and personal details that read like a dossier compiled by a private investigator. My hands were shaking as I spread the papers across David's desk, the afternoon sunlight streaming through the window and illuminating every detail with crystal clarity. Someone had been systematically gathering information about our family, documenting our secrets with the thoroughness of a professional researcher. I called David at work, my voice tight with panic as I tried to explain what I had found. He promised to come home immediately, and I spent the 20-minute wait pacing between the office and the kitchen, clutching the phone in my hand like a lifeline. When David's car pulled into our driveway, I was waiting at the front door, the mysterious file folder clutched against my chest. His face was pale as he hurried up the walkway, loosening his tie with jerky, nervous movements. The late afternoon heat hit us like a physical force as we stood on our front porch, but I was shivering as if it were the middle of winter. We spread the contents of the folder across our dining room table, that solid oak piece we had inherited from David's parents, and tried to make sense of what we were seeing. The papers were arranged chronologically, starting from about 6 months ago, documenting our financial situation with frightening accuracy. There were photocopies of deposit slips, notes about our spending habits, even printed emails that I did not remember sending. Someone had been tracking our activities with the dedication of a forensic accountant, building a comprehensive picture of our private life piece by piece. David picked up one of the printed emails, his face growing darker as he read. It was a message I had sent to my friend Linda, discussing Emma's struggles with her eating disorder and our decision to seek professional help. The timestamp showed it had been printed 3 weeks ago, but I did not remember forwarding it to anyone or saving it to any shared folder. That was when David noticed something that made his face go completely white. In the upper left corner of several documents, almost too faint to see, was a small notation in blue ink. The initials MR followed by what looked like a file number. Marcus Rodriguez. Sarah's husband. The man who had been coming to our family dinners for 12 years, who had been present for countless conversations, who had access to our home and our trust and our most guarded secrets. The realization hit me like a physical blow, doubling me over as if someone had punched me in the stomach. The familiar scent of our dining room, that mixture of furniture polish and the lavender candles I burned every Sunday, suddenly seemed cloying and overwhelming. I gripped the edge of the table, my knuckles white against the dark wood, trying to process the magnitude of this betrayal. Marcus had been in our home dozens of times over the past 6 months. He had helped David with computer problems, accessing our family desktop to install software and troubleshoot internet issues. He had offered to help me organize financial documents when I mentioned feeling overwhelmed by tax preparation. He had been the perfect helpful brother-in-law, always ready with technical expertise and friendly assistance. And apparently, he had been systematically stealing our private information and selling it to a reporter. David was on the phone with the police within minutes, his voice steady despite the fury I could see building behind his eyes. The dispatcher took our information and promised to send an officer to take our statement, but warned that cases involving alleged theft of information could be complicated to prosecute. While we waited for the police to arrive, I called my sister Sarah, my hands trembling so badly I could barely dial her number. Her voice was bright and cheerful when she answered, asking about dinner plans for the upcoming weekend and chattering about the boys' soccer practice schedule. I interrupted her mid-sentence, my voice harsh with emotion as I demanded to know where Marcus was and what he had been doing with information about our family. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the sound of her breathing and the distant noise of children playing in her background. When she finally spoke, her voice was small and defeated. She told me that Marcus had been approached by Jennifer Walsh 6 months ago, soon after the reporter had begun investigating what she called financial irregularities and suburban inheritance patterns. Sarah claimed she had known nothing about it until recently, when Marcus had confessed to providing information in exchange for payment. The words hit me like individual hammer blows, each revelation more painful than the last. My sister, my only sibling, the person who had been my closest confidant and ally throughout childhood and into adulthood, had known her husband was betraying our family and had said nothing. According to Sarah, Marcus had justified his actions by claiming that secrets were toxic to families, that bringing everything into the open would ultimately be healthier for everyone involved. He had convinced himself that he was doing us a favor by forcing the truth into daylight, even as he collected payments from Jennifer Walsh for every piece of information he provided. The police officer who arrived 40 minutes later was a young woman with kind eyes and a patient manner, but she confirmed our worst fears about the legal implications of what had happened. Unless we could prove that Marcus had gained access to our information through illegal means, rather than through our voluntary sharing of family details, prosecution would be extremely difficult. She took our statement and collected copies of the documents we had found, but her expression made it clear that she held little hope for criminal charges. Information shared within families, even when later sold to third parties, existed in a legal gray area that rarely resulted in successful prosecutions. After she left, David and I sat in our living room as evening shadows lengthened across the hardwood floor. The familiar space, with its comfortable sofas and family photographs and carefully chosen decorative touches, felt like a museum exhibit from someone else's life. Everything looked the same, but nothing would ever be the same again. We talked through our options, voices subdued in the gathering dusk. We could try to pursue civil action against Marcus, but the costs would likely exceed any potential recovery. We could demand that Jennifer Walsh kill her story, but she had made it clear that she had enough information from other sources to proceed regardless of our cooperation. Most painfully, we had to decide what to do about Sarah and Marcus, about the future of relationships that had been central to our lives for over a decade. How do you continue to love someone who has stood by while their spouse systematically betrayed your trust? How do you sit across from someone at Sunday dinner knowing they have sold your secrets to the highest bidder? The phone rang again around 8 o'clock, Sarah's number appearing on the caller ID display. David answered, his voice carefully controlled as he listened to whatever my sister was saying. I could hear the rise and fall of her voice through the speaker, urgent and pleading, but I could not make out individual words. When he hung up, David told me that Sarah was coming over alone. Marcus had gone to stay with his brother while they figured things out, and she wanted to explain everything in person. Despite my anger and hurt, I agreed to see her, needing to understand how our family had arrived at this point of complete dissolution. Sarah arrived 20 minutes later, her eyes red from crying, clutching a tissue in one hand and her car keys in the other. She had clearly dressed hastily, wearing a wrinkled t-shirt and jeans, her usually perfect hair pulled back in a messy ponytail. The scent of her perfume, that floral fragrance she had worn for years, mixed with the salt smell of dried tears and something else I could not identify. We sat in our living room, the three of us arranged like points on a triangle, with acres of unspoken recrimination filling the space between us. Sarah's voice was hoarse as she began to tell us the whole story, starting from the beginning, when Marcus had first been contacted by Jennifer Walsh. According to my sister, the reporter had initially approached Marcus at his job, presenting herself as someone investigating patterns of inheritance distribution in middle-class families. She had claimed to be working on a story about wealth inequality and wanted to understand how unexpected inheritances affected family dynamics in suburban communities. Marcus, flattered by the attention and intrigued by the subject matter, had agreed to an initial interview. He had spoken generally about inheritance patterns he had observed, mentioning our situation as an example without initially revealing identifying details. But Jennifer Walsh had been skilled at asking follow-up questions, gradually extracting more specific information with each subsequent conversation. Sarah claimed that Marcus had rationalized his increasing cooperation by telling himself he was contributing to important social commentary. He had convinced himself that highlighting the secrecy around money in families could help other people navigate similar situations more openly and honestly. But as the months progressed and his payments from Jennifer Walsh increased, his motivations had clearly shifted from social consciousness to financial gain. He had begun actively seeking out information to share, accessing our computer files during visits, photographing documents when we were out of the room, even going through our mail when helping with household tasks. Sarah insisted she had known nothing until 3 weeks ago, when she had discovered the cash payments Marcus had been hiding in their spare bedroom closet. When she confronted him, he had broken down and confessed everything, claiming he had gotten in too deep to back out safely. As I listened to my sister's explanation, I felt the last vestiges of trust and family loyalty crumbling inside my chest like ancient paper exposed to air. Whether Sarah had been complicit from the beginning or merely willfully blind to her husband's activities, the result was the same. Our most private moments had been commodified and sold, our struggles and secrets transformed into marketable content for a stranger's professional advancement. The conversation lasted nearly 2 hours, taking us deep into the night as Sarah alternated between tearful apologies and defensive justifications. She claimed that Marcus had been struggling financially due to some poor investment decisions, that the money from Jennifer Walsh had seemed like a lifeline when they were facing potential foreclosure on their house. She begged us to understand that he had never intended to hurt anyone, that he had convinced himself he was helping by bringing family secrets into the open where they could be addressed honestly. She promised that he was deeply remorseful and wanted to make amends, though she could not explain exactly what form those amends might take. David's response was measured but final. He told Sarah that while he understood the financial pressures they had been facing, Marcus's systematic betrayal of our trust could not be explained away by good intentions or economic necessity. The damage to our relationships and our family's privacy was irreversible, and we needed time and space to decide how to move forward. After Sarah left, driving away into the humid night with her headlights cutting through the darkness, David and I sat in our kitchen drinking tea and trying to process the complete demolition of our family structure. The familiar space felt different now, contaminated by the knowledge that our most private conversations had been documented and sold. I found myself looking at ordinary objects with new suspicion, wondering what information they might reveal to someone with malicious intent. The stack of mail on our counter, the family calendar hanging beside the refrigerator, the photos arranged on the windowsill above the sink, all seemed suddenly vulnerable and exposed. We talked about changing our locks, upgrading our computer security, being more careful about what documents we left accessible when family members visited. But the real damage was not to our physical security but to our sense of safety within our own relationships, the fundamental trust that had allowed us to be vulnerable and authentic with people we loved. The next morning brought a call from Jennifer Walsh, who informed us that her story would be published in Sunday's paper despite our lack of cooperation. She offered us one final opportunity to provide our perspective on the events she planned to describe, but her tone made it clear that the story would proceed regardless of our participation. David took the call, his voice steady as he declined her offer and requested that she minimize the use of identifying details about our family members. She made no promises but agreed to consider his request, and I could hear the satisfaction in her voice as she wished us a pleasant day and ended the call. That evening, we drove to our daughter Emma's apartment across town, needing to warn her about the upcoming article before she heard about it from other sources. The trip through familiar neighborhoods felt surreal, as if we were tourists visiting scenes from someone else's life rather than residents of our own community. Emma lived in a converted warehouse district, her loft apartment filled with the kind of eclectic furniture and artistic decorations that reflected her work as a graphic designer. The space smelled like coffee and acrylic paint, with late afternoon sunlight streaming through tall windows and casting geometric shadows across polished concrete floors. She listened to our explanation with growing horror, her artistic sensibilities particularly offended by the mercenary nature of Marcus's betrayal. Emma had always been close to Sarah, considering her aunt more like an older sister due to their relatively small age gap, and the revelation that Sarah had known about Marcus's activities devastated her almost as much as it had us. We spent the evening at Emma's apartment, ordering Chinese food and trying to maintain some semblance of normal family interaction while processing the complete upheaval of our relationships. The familiar ritual of sharing lo mein and fried rice from paper containers felt both comforting and surreal, a reminder of countless similar evenings that now seemed to belong to a different era. Emma insisted on reading the article as soon as it was published online, and we agreed to meet for breakfast Sunday morning to discuss whatever revelations Jennifer Walsh had chosen to include. I dreaded seeing our private struggles reduced to newspaper copy, but I also felt a perverse curiosity about how our lives would be portrayed for public consumption. Sunday morning arrived gray and drizzly, the kind of weather that matches internal emotional states and makes everything feel slightly out of focus. We met Emma at a small diner near her apartment, one of those timeless places with red vinyl booths and coffee that tastes like it has been brewing for decades. The article had been published online at midnight, and Emma had stayed up reading it with the horrified fascination of someone watching a car accident in slow motion. She handed us printouts across the diner table, her face pale in the fluorescent lighting, and warned us that Jennifer Walsh had been thorough in her reporting. The headline read, "Hidden Inheritances and Family Secrets, How Middle-Class Families Navigate Unexpected Wealth." Our story was presented as a case study in the complex dynamics of money and secrecy within suburban families, with enough identifying details changed to provide minimal legal protection while making us easily recognizable to anyone who knew us personally. Jennifer Walsh had woven our private struggles into a broader narrative about wealth inequality and family communication, presenting Marcus as a conflicted whistleblower who had struggled with the ethical implications of exposing family secrets while believing that transparency would ultimately benefit everyone involved. The article included quotes from family therapy experts about the psychological impact of financial secrecy, statistics about inheritance patterns in middle-class families, and sidebar discussions of similar cases where hidden assets had disrupted family relationships. Our personal pain had been transformed into sociological commentary, our private struggles reframed as teaching moments for readers interested in family financial planning. Reading about my affair in the context of academic analysis of marital stress factors felt like psychological violence, a final violation that reduced the most painful period of our marriage to a data point in someone else's professional advancement. The article mentioned David's gambling struggles as an example of how financial pressure could exacerbate existing behavioral issues, with no acknowledgement of the courage and commitment it had taken for him to address his problem and rebuild our trust. Emma's eating disorder was discussed as a typical response to family stress among adolescent females, with clinical descriptions that completely ignored the terror and helplessness David and I had felt watching our daughter literally waste away before our eyes. The months of careful monitoring, gentle encouragement, and professional therapy were reduced to a single paragraph about appropriate interventions and positive outcomes. But perhaps most painful was how Jennifer Walsh portrayed our decision to keep grandmother's inheritance private. What had seemed like reasonable discretion to protect family harmony was presented as evidence of the toxic nature of financial secrecy, with expert commentary suggesting that our approach had actually created more problems than it solved. The article concluded with Marcus's explanation of his motivations, presented sympathetically as the struggle of someone caught between loyalty to family and commitment to social transparency. Jennifer Walsh had given him the final word, allowing him to position himself as a reluctant truth-teller whose difficult decision had ultimately served the greater good. We sat in the diner booth reading and rereading the article, our breakfast growing cold as we absorbed the public dissection of our private lives. The familiar sounds of the restaurant, clattering dishes and muffled conversations, seemed to fade into background noise as we confronted the reality that our most guarded secrets were now available for consumption by anyone with internet access. Emma was furious in the way that only someone in their 20s can be, her anger pure and uncomplicated by the complex emotions David and I were struggling to process. She wanted to sue for invasion of privacy, to demand retractions, to fight back against what she saw as a clear violation of journalistic ethics. But David and I were exhausted by the emotional toll of the past week, drained by the constant revelation of new betrayals and violations. The legal system offered little recourse for the type of damage we had suffered, and pursuing justice would only extend our exposure to public scrutiny and legal costs we could not afford. Over the following weeks, we began the painful process of rebuilding our lives within the wreckage of our shattered family relationships. Sarah called repeatedly, her messages becoming increasingly desperate as we failed to return her attempts at communication. Marcus sent a long email apologizing for his actions and offering to donate his payments from Jennifer Walsh to a charity of our choosing, a gesture that felt both inadequate and insulting. We changed our phone numbers, installed new locks on our doors, and began the slow work of learning to trust each other again in a world where privacy felt like an impossible luxury. David started seeing a counselor to help process his feelings of violation and betrayal, while I threw myself into work with the kind of manic energy that comes from needing to control at least one aspect of a life that felt completely out of control. The article had attracted attention from other media outlets, and we received calls from television producers interested in developing our story for broadcast. Each request felt like salt rubbed into an open wound, another reminder that our pain had entertainment value for strangers who would never understand the real cost of Marcus's betrayal. Friends and neighbors who had read the article approached us with a mixture of sympathy and curiosity, their well-meaning expressions of support tinged with the kind of fascination that comes from witnessing someone else's private catastrophe. Every trip to the grocery store or gas station became an exercise in managing unwanted attention and intrusive questions. Emma struggled with her own feelings of exposure, knowing that her colleagues and friends could now read clinical descriptions of her most difficult adolescent period. She considered changing jobs, moving to a different city, anything to escape the sense that her private struggles were now public knowledge. Our son Michael, who lived in another state and had maintained more distance from the extended family drama, offered to let us stay with him while things settled down. The temptation to flee our community and start over somewhere else was strong, but running away felt like allowing Marcus's betrayal to steal our home as well as our privacy. Gradually, painfully, we began to establish new routines and relationships based on hard-earned wisdom about the nature of trust and vulnerability. We learned to be more careful about what information we shared and with whom, developing the kind of protective instincts that should have been unnecessary within our own family. The relationship with Sarah remained frozen in a state of unresolved pain and mutual recrimination. She continued to insist that she had been as much a victim of Marcus's deception as we were, while we struggled to understand how she could have remained ignorant of activities that had been occurring in her own household for months. Marcus had moved out of their house and was living with his brother while they went through divorce proceedings, another casualty of the chain reaction his actions had set in motion. Sarah claimed she was shocked by his behavior and had never suspected the extent of his betrayal, but her claims of innocence felt hollow in light of the evidence we had discovered. The money from grandmother's inheritance, once a source of security and pride, now felt tainted by the knowledge that it had been the catalyst for so much family destruction. We considered donating it to charity, removing the source of the secrecy that had ultimately provided Marcus with his marketable information, but keeping it felt like the only way to prevent his betrayal from causing even more financial damage to our future. As autumn arrived and the immediate crisis began to fade into painful memory, we started to contemplate what lessons could be learned from our experience. The violations we had suffered were irreversible, the relationships we had lost might never be fully restored, but we had survived the complete dismantling of our family structure and emerged with our marriage intact. David's gambling problem, dragged into public view against our will, became something we could discuss more openly with close friends who offered support and understanding. My affair, exposed to the world in clinical language, lost some of its power to cause shame as we realized that most people were more interested in the sociology of family secrets than in judging our personal struggles. Emma's eating disorder, transformed into a case study for academic analysis, began to feel like part of her personal history rather than a defining characteristic she needed to hide. The process of having our private pain made public had been excruciating, but it had also removed the exhausting burden of maintaining perfect facades for the outside world. Winter brought a different kind of peace, the kind that comes from accepting losses that cannot be recovered rather than continuing to fight battles that cannot be won. We decorated our house for Christmas with a smaller circle of family and friends, learning to find joy in relationships based on genuine rather than assumed trust. Jennifer Walsh's article had won some kind of journalism award for its sensitive handling of complex family dynamics, an honor that felt like a final insult but also provided a strange kind of closure. Our pain had been transformed into professional recognition for someone else, but dwelling on that injustice would only extend our suffering without changing the outcome. Sarah reached out one more time in early December, asking if we could meet to discuss the possibility of reconciliation. Her message mentioned therapy and Marcus's continued absence from her life, suggesting that she was finally ready to take full responsibility for her role in the betrayal that had destroyed our family unity. David and I discussed her request over dinner, weighing the potential benefits of forgiveness against the risk of reopening wounds that were just beginning to heal. We decided to agree to a meeting, but with the understanding that any future relationship would require complete honesty about her knowledge of Marcus's activities and her reasons for remaining silent. The meeting took place on a cold January afternoon in a neutral location, a coffee shop halfway between our houses that neither of us had visited before. Sarah looked older, worn down by months of stress and guilt, her usual confidence replaced by the careful manner of someone who had learned not to take forgiveness for granted. She told us that she had known something was wrong but had chosen not to investigate, afraid of what she might discover and unwilling to confront the possibility that her husband was capable of such systematic betrayal. Her silence had been born of cowardice rather than complicity, but the result had been the same. The conversation lasted 3 hours, taking us through the entire timeline of Marcus's activities from Sarah's perspective, including details she had been afraid to share earlier. She had found unexplained cash in their house months before discovering the source, had noticed Marcus's secretive phone calls and computer use, had even seen some of our family documents among his papers without understanding their significance. Her willingness to be completely honest about her own failures and fears opened the door to a different kind of relationship, one based on acknowledged imperfection rather than assumed trust. We agreed to begin slowly, with occasional phone calls and careful conversations, testing whether the foundation of our sisterhood could be rebuilt on more realistic grounds. The process of forgiveness proved to be ongoing rather than a single decision, requiring daily choices to release resentment and focus on the future rather than dwelling on past violations. Some days were easier than others, and there were setbacks when news of Marcus or references to the article would reopen partially healed wounds. But gradually, we began to construct a new version of family life that acknowledged the reality of human weakness and the fragility of trust while still making space for love and connection. Emma remained more resistant to reconciliation with Sarah, her anger slower to fade and her standards for family loyalty uncompromising in the way that often characterizes young adult relationships. As spring arrived and we approached the first anniversary of Jennifer Walsh's initial contact, we realized that we had survived something that had felt unsurvivable at the time. Our family looked different now, with new boundaries and more carefully guarded privacy, but it had not been destroyed by Marcus's betrayal. The scars remained, visible in the way we now scrutinized requests for information, in our reluctance to share details about our financial situation, in Emma's ongoing discomfort with family gatherings that felt too exposed or vulnerable. But scars can also represent healing, evidence that wounds have closed and life has continued despite significant damage.